Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm again joined by Keith Preston to discuss his vision of Pan-Anarchism. Today we're going to talk about, the title of today's episode is After the State, Then What? A lot of people have a hard time, I think, conceptualizing what does stateless society even look like, which of course is one of the biggest hurdles in getting people to even look into the idea of a stateless society. Now, from the top of my head, I can think of historic examples like hunter-gatherers and nomadic peoples, which, of course, anarchists would likely not want to replicate in the 21st century, at least on a grand scale. So, because we're assuming industrialization, post-industrial maybe even, and a high level of technology, at least for some. And so then how might one go about looking at that? So I guess to start off with, Keith, the anarchist wakes up in the morning, gets his coffee, gets ready to go to work. So what does a day look like for somebody in an anarchist stateless society?
Well, I think that would depend a great deal on the individuals involved and the kinds of communities and organizations and institutions they were associated with. I don't think that there's any one-size-fits-all model, and I think this is probably the first point that a lot of anarchists as well as critics of anarchism lose sight of, in the sense that there wouldn't be one universal system, so there wouldn't be any one way of doing things. You mentioned technology. There would certainly, I think, there are anarchists who disagree, but there would certainly be at least some organizations, associations, institutions, communities, whatever, that were very technologically driven. And there would be others perhaps that were not, that were more agrarian or agricultural or back to the land. So ultimately, it would depend on the individual and the kind of community they were involved in. Now, for most people in our own society, the norm is you get up, you go to work, and that's basically it for most people. Or you go to school if you're a youngster. And most people, that's where they spend most of their time, work or school. Now, the big issue is what kind of modes of production would actually exist in anarchism. You find a wide range of opinions on that, but some of the major opinions are on the right end. You have the anarcho-capitalists, many of whom say, well, minus the state, we would have something like the current economic system. We'd still have big business and we still have transnational companies and all that kind of stuff, except things like labor exploitation or whatever would not really be a problem, because minus the state, minus central banking, we wouldn't have inflation, or at least not as much inflation as we have now, or with minus legislation that creates, that blocks competition, we would have a proliferation of more enterprises and more workplaces for workers to choose from, and that would increase worker bargaining power. And then companies that do things to hurt consumers, they'd be held to strict liability. They wouldn't be able to engage in regulatory capture and all that. So that's the more right end of anarchism that would argue that. Now, on the far left end, you have a point of view that's kind of like the Marxists, or something that, or like the utopians. The idea, well, the motivation that people have to labor would be purely social. That is, on one hand, people would be guaranteed, or at least have access to the resources they need to meet their basic needs. So people's motivation to work and produce would be social in nature or cultural in nature. People would naturally not just want to sit around and do nothing. People want to go out and be productive, or people would build things just because they like to build things, or people would engage in farming because they like to farm, and all of that kind of stuff. And they'll use examples like, well, why is it that somebody that goes and works a hard day at work for 8 or 10 hours still comes home and works in their garden after work? Why aren't they just sitting down drinking beer and watching TV or something like that? So that's, and then they say that in a minus the state and the centralization of resources, there will be enough abundance that most people can have at least their basic needs met. That's basically anarcho-communism or something like it. There are others who believe that technological progress will be something that occurs much more rapidly minus the state. So we'll be able to produce stuff that we need in a much easier or quicker way, so we don't have to spend as much time as work, or robots will be doing all the work, so we just sit back and reap the benefits. Or There are others who go in the other direction. They say that, well, you can't really have modern technology, the sophisticated modern technology, without the state. So they envision everybody going back to an agrarian type of way of life. Now, I don't think any one of these models would be universal or absolute. I think that in an anarchist society or civilization or whatever, you would find mixtures of all of these to some degree. I tend to have a somewhat middle of the road point of view on these things, in the sense that I don't necessarily think that, what's called full communism, the idea that, well, people are just going to work for purely social motivations and everybody's just going to take whatever they need, and people are going to get their basic needs met, and without, regardless of what they contribute to the group in return. That I think may work in certain kinds of circumstances, but for the most part, no. I don't think, as on a mass scale, I'm less certain about that. I don't think, though, that the anarcho-capitalist view is radical enough, in the sense that I tend to lean towards the view that, minus all of the ways in which the state does function to centralize control over wealth and resources, that you would have a much different kind of economy. And I don't think that the profit-based economy, where everything is just about commercial exchange for the generation of profit, would necessarily be dominant, or be dominant to the degree that it is. I tend to think, minus the state, you would still have exchange. I'm not talking about something where people just grow their own food in the backyard or something like that. There might be some people that do that, but I think it would be more of a system of reciprocal exchange rather than profit exchange by groups and regions and communities and individuals and things of that nature. So I'm kind of in the, I guess, what's commonly called the libertarian socialist camp. Don't think that anarcho-communism in the most radical sense would necessarily be dominant, nor do I think that that we would have simply the present system minus the state, which a lot of the anarcho-capitalists believe in. I'm somewhere between those two extremes.
Okay. On the domestic level, we'll deal with foreign policy and national defense on another episode. But what domestic services or utilities that we commonly associate with being supplied by the state do you think would exist in this new society? How would they be produced, or would they be produced at all in some cases?
Well, it depends on what kind of services you're talking about. One might be utility services. There are some anarchists who believe that something like the electrical services, or sewage and all the utilities, the basic public utilities, there are many who believe that those would be run by the workers. The people who actually are employed by these institutions would have their own workers' councils or labor unions or something like that, and through these organizations they would manage and administrate these institutions. There's others who are more consumer oriented, who think that all of these things would be more like cooperatives, or perhaps they might be a type of partnership between workers' councils and consumer cooperatives. The anarcho-capitalist envision something where all these are completely private. They're all completely private, and it's a fee-for-service type of thing, and there's no state involvement at all. Of course, the primitivists often do not believe in some of these things. They think we should not have electricity or whatever, so we should go back to using kerosene lamps or building a fire or whatever if we want light. That's yet another point of view. Again, I think this would largely be dependent upon the particular community involved, the particular region involved, the particular cultural backdrop that's involved, the particular form of anarchism that became popular or prevalent or dominant in a particular situation. It would depend on the particular needs of the community involved. But it's generally speaking, minus the state, things like basic utilities would be either, if you're an anarcho-capitalist, it would be a fee-for-service business enterprise, or consumer cooperative, or worker-run organization, a workers' council, syndicate, something like that, or some kind of something based on controlled by community assemblies. You have this idea called stakeholder democracy, which some anarchists are interested in, where everyone it's sort of like a community council where everyone who has a stake in the management of these kinds of facilities has representation and recallable delegates and things like that, meaning neighborhoods, consumer rights groups, workers, all of these different stakeholders.
Okay. One thing when it comes to economics as a whole, and I'd like to see if you agree with this or not, is I tend to think in a decentralized anarchist society or federation of anarchist societies, you wouldn't have anything called the national economy like we would have had in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. I think you'd see a lot more local economies like in the 18th and 19th century. And so by extension, it would be highly unlikely that you'd see mega transnational corporations because they tend to be a product of a national economy. So I think that whatever the particular arrangements are, whether it's, like you said, for profit or for social motivation, I think that meta question would be something along those lines. Do you agree?
Yeah, well, I'll go even further than that. As far as national economies, to use the United States as an example, the so-called national economy is the creation of the state in a big way, and that's certainly true of modern industry and technology and all of that. We don't have in the United States a free enterprise system, and we don't have socialism in the way that traditional socialists envision it either. But we do have a type of command economy. I mean, the national economy we have in the United States is a command economy that's coordinated through the government, the Pentagon, the military, the central banks, the mass corporations, which are in turn aligned with the state, and all of the different kinds of institutions that intersect in those ways. And it was set up to be that way. Even if we go back to the original U.S. Constitution, if we look at the enumerated powers that are listed in the Constitution, and if we look at the actual class background of the people who wrote the U.S. Constitution, we see that the class they came from were what the Europeans thought of at the time as the middle class. And that is, these were wealthy merchants, bankers, and planters, but they were not titled. They were not titled aristocrats like counts and all of that kind of stuff. They were the next class underneath that, underneath the royalty and aristocracy, the middle class or the middling class or whatever, the gentry in the case of landowners. But that's what the United States was set up to be, a dictatorship of the upper middle class, a class dictatorship of the upper middle class. And if you look at the enumerated powers in the Constitution, what are they? Well, one is they say internal improvements. What that basically means is corporate welfare for the purpose of facilitating commerce, things like that, which in those days meant building canals and that kind of stuff, and then later railroads, and then later, the interstate highway system and many other things like that nowadays. But all of that was for the purpose of facilitating commerce. Also, another enumerated power was to impose uniform bankruptcy laws on the states, meaning that some of the states on the Articles of Confederation had been too sympathetic to debtors and farmers, and they wanted to impose a uniform bankruptcy system that was more sympathetic to bankers and creditors. And then another one is to issue patents. Well, that's basically what we today call intellectual property, which is essentially a monopoly over technological innovations. And I could keep going on with that, but the point's been made. So you're right that we wouldn't have in the United States, and most other nations have a similar system. We wouldn't have a national economy per se. Now, it's certainly true there could be economic networks that extend on a national or transnational basis. Of course, that gets into the question of whether we'd even have nations in a conventional sense. But it's theoretically possible, that without the state, we might have economic networks that transcend, the United States and Canada and Mexico, or whatever. But it wouldn't be something that's imposed from the center. It'd be something that's organized from the bottom up and extends outward. But there would also be a lot more localized production for local use. One of the impacts, for example, of the interstate highway system is that that's essentially a transportation subsidy for large commercial firms that are heavily dependent on shipping. A good example is something like Walmart. I mean, the reason these Walmart type places and others like that are as successful as they are is because their shipping costs to a large degree are underwritten by the state, which in turn gives them the ability to undercut local businesses and things like that. So I think, we would have a more decentralized economy where production is done locally for local use, with economic networks perhaps extending outward from the bottom up, but we wouldn't have anything like the national economy in the traditional sense.
I think a necessary corollary to this is there would not be a military-industrial complex. There would certainly be maybe local arms manufacturing, but you wouldn't have you wouldn't wake up and go to Lockheed Martin to work in the morning. Something like Lockheed Martin wouldn't exist.
That's the first thing we're going to get rid of.
Now, the one thing that is interesting to speculate, given the scale of an anarchist economy, certain weapon systems probably just wouldn't be produced. And the anarchists would object to them probably in principle, like say nuclear weapons, because they're indiscriminate. But even things that are not necessarily indiscriminate, things like main battle tanks, aircraft carriers, and stealth bombers, it's hard to envision a sort of artisan style economy or local businesses building those things. But then again, they may not need them either because it's a more defensive posture as well. So, but what do you think about the effects that would have on military production and such?
Well, I think another way to frame that question would be, what would be the effects on technological production on a general level? We could talk about military production, but there's all kinds of other technological forms of production, like the tech industry, like social media, like Google and Facebook and stuff like that.
Well, let me insert myself for real quick, since we're going to expand the question here. One of the things that we historically see is that technology is often progresses in concert with war and the state. So a good example would be the microchip. That was initially fun. Now, Bell Labs, a private company, did the research, but it was the state that gave them the contracts, and they wanted computers to model nuclear weapons explosions. We could look at other things like penicillin that was developed during World War I and II. So without a state and a national economy, I think it's quite likely that technology would grow to a snail's pace.
So technology would grow at a slower pace?
It would go at a snail's pace, because without the state and war to feed it, I don't see how it would develop as rapidly as it has in the last 100 years.
I think you would actually see some of both. I think that there are certain kinds of technology that would certainly grow at a much rapid pace if they would even appear at all. I think there are other kinds of technology that would probably grow at a more rapid pace. I think technology of the type that has some practical purpose for localized use or personal use, those kinds of technologies I suspect may grow at a more rapid pace because there would be a greater need for it. The kinds of technologies that have come out of military production and all that, perhaps those would grow at a slower pace. I hope they would. But at the same time, I do think that there are other forms of technology that might grow more rapidly, in the sense that if there was some perceived and overwhelming need for it. For instance, the energy production. I tend to look at it like what would most likely happen with energy production is that on one hand, there might be a switch to more low-tech forms of energy production, like the water use of solar power and windmills and things like that. At the same time, now many anarchists would disagree with me on this, but I also think it's also quite possible that nuclear energy actually might be more likely to happen minus the state rather than with the state. And I think the reason for that is people would still have energy needs, and most people don't want to do without energy. There's a minority of anarchists who believe that, but for the most part, certainly most anarchists don't believe that, and certainly most people generally don't believe that. Most people want energy. And of course, there's a big objection to fossil fuels and all that over related to environmental issues. But I do think that given the overwhelming need for energy, given if there was a prevailing sentiment against the use of fossil fuels, given the absence of this government's support for the fossil fuel industry, it's quite possible that you would have networks of technical workers and scientific researchers, other specialists that would actually be able to develop and apply nuclear energy at a more rapid pace than what we actually have now.
Interesting. So what level, here's an interesting question. What kinds of technologies do you think could only develop within the context of a national economy and therefore would go underdeveloped in an anarchist society? And what kinds of technologies do you think are more amenable to small scale production? Because the way modern R&D is done is you have states monopolizing the funding, and they pick specific state universities, which are technically private institutions, but they get massive contracts and subsidies from the government. And even things that we today would not necessarily associate with military uses, like computers, nylon, plastics, they were all invented for the military-industrial complex during World War II.
Yeah, I think that what we see today is what or economic distortions that are rooted in slanting production towards these kinds of interests. That is, military production and also production on behalf of politically connected corporations. I think if you took that out of the equation, that's the first thing that you look at. What is an economy going to be like without military production of the kind that we're accustomed to, without the government propping up, say, the fossil fuel industry or whatever. The issue there is, I think the real question is, to what degree can forms of production or technological development that are capital intensive and seriously labor intensive actually come into being minus the state. There are certain kinds of technologies that aren't that capital intensive or aren't that labor intensive, but there's some that are. And I think it comes down to basically the degree to which large numbers of people feel a need for a particular technology. For instance, most people feel the need for healthcare. Most people are interested, a lot of people want to work in healthcare related fields. Every other student I have is a nursing student or something like that. People see that as a vital and critical service, and other things too, energy and all of that. So I think capital intensive technologies and industries may, in some instances, experience a regression, particularly if they are technologies that largely serve the purpose of benefiting vested interests in such a way that the general society does not benefit or does not benefit as much. Military production is an obvious example. There are some other examples as well. But I think that when it comes to technology there is an overwhelming demand for. I don't mean just a consumer demand, like consumer products, like new cars and stuff like that. I mean things people think they really need. Healthcare is an obvious example. I think that there would still be plenty of incentive for there to be methods that are found for the development of something like technologically sophisticated healthcare, and you would do that through bottom-up extended networks of healthcare professionals, workers, technicians, specialists, and all of that. So I don't think that you would have a technological regression. There are some anarchists who think, well, without the state, we're just going to go back to living in mud huts, or we're going to live like the Amish. And some people might do that, but I don't necessarily think that would be the norm. I think that technology would continue. I think certain kinds of technology might even expand at a more rapid rate. I think other kinds of technology might suffer regression. Some of it would be technology that's more harmful than good anyway. But again, it would depend on removing some of these kinds of distortions from the economy that we currently see.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit to social issues. The right-left libertarian divide tends to be on radical individualism versus communitarianism. Now, of course, depending on the context in an anarchist society, some might err more in one direction than the other. But overall, which do you think, for practical reasons, would likely be the more dominant anarchist ethos? A sort of strong sense of communitarianism, which is often associated with Christian and left anarchists, or radical individualism like the egoists and the ANCAPs?
Well, I think that this is an issue where many, if not even most anarchists, actually miss a lot of important points. Because from what I have seen, most anarchists simply regurgitate the values of the liberal left, and often in a way that approaches parody status, in fact. And we've seen all that with the social justice warrior types and all that. And then those anarchists and libertarians who don't buy into that point of view often go in the other direction. And some have an interest in radical traditionalism and all of this kind of stuff. I think that on one hand, those points of view are correct in the sense that what I see happening with cultural and social questions, minus the state, is without a political entity that is trying to impose a uniform set of cultural values, you're going to see more rather than less cultural diversity. And at the same time, you're going to see all kinds of diversity that sets up extreme dichotomies. A good example might be, let's take cities, for example. Like large cities where there's a large concentration of people, like London or New York or Los Angeles, minus the state, because the local governments, municipal governments, also try to impose a universal system of values. I used to be involved in municipal political activism, and I saw that to the limit. I mean, they try to impose the bourgeois, middle class commercial culture on everything. Minus that, I think that what you would actually see is the proliferation of a much greater amount of cultural diversity, certainly in places where there's a large population group. For instance, one set of issues that a lot of the left type anarchists tend to be interested in are things like gender, race, sexuality, all those kinds of things. I actually think that in an anarchist society, or at least in certain types of anarchist societies, things like race, gender, sexuality, religion, all of those kinds of things would not be necessarily any more significant than different kinds of subcultures that we have now. They wouldn't be any different than fans of different sports franchises, or fans of different movies genres, or fans of different music subcultures, or all the subcultures you find in high school, the nerds and jocks and geeks and all that kind of stuff. But I think races and genders and religions would be comparable to all that. Certainly, I think that would be the case in places that were heavily populated, large cities. A general historical rule is that cultures that are connected to water tend to be very, not comparatively speaking, they tend to be more cosmopolitan, more quote unquote liberal, to use modern terminology, whereas cultures that tend to be more landlocked and away from water tend to be more conservative or traditional. Also, places that are more sparsely populated tend to be more conservative or traditional. And places that are less commercially oriented tend to be more conservative. Places that are communities that are more collective tend to be more conservative. It's actually individualism that tends to breed libertarianism. It's like commercial individualistic societies tend to be more libertine in their cultural norms than collective societies. So again, I think you'd see a lot of extreme dichotomies coming about. I think in some places, particularly large urban centers or commercial areas, you might see actual cultures built up around transracial people like Rachel Dolezal. I was born white, but I identify as black, or the transgender thing, or, the other kin movement, people who identify as other species or vampires or something. I could actually see actual cultures being built up around this. I could actually see communities, neighborhoods being developed where you have the night owls community where, okay, all the businesses are closed, or shops, or whatever kind of economy they have, that's all closed during the day and everybody works at night. Everybody sleeps during the day. I actually knew someone once that wanted to set up an intentional community like that. But without a state or a government imposing a uniform system, that kind of stuff can happen. Now, it's also true, though, that parallel to that, you would not have, minus the state, things like anti-discrimination laws. So you would not have somebody saying that you cannot exclude people that you don't like for whatever reason. I saw an article just today about how there was a music festival, I think in Sweden, where it was a man-free music festival, where it was all just, no cisgendered men allowed. It was basically just for feminists and transsexuals, pretty much. But they actually got busted for violating Sweden's discrimination laws. So in minus the state, you could have your feminist and transgender only, or women and transgender only music festival, but then you could have your man only music festival, or your white only music festival, or your Christian only music festival, or whatever. So you would not have the state forcing integration. On one hand, you'd see the proliferation of all kinds of, fairly extreme forms of diversity, including stuff that most people today would think is really far out. But at the same time, the state is not restricting anyone from freely associating, and by extension, excluding in any way that they want. So there, in that sense, you might actually have, on one hand, the proliferation of transracials and transgenders and trans species and other kin and all the people who claim to be UFOs or vampires or whatever, Parallel to that, you might have communities that are very exclusionary. They say, no, we don't want any meat eaters in our community, or we don't want any gun nuts in our community, or we don't want any drug users in our community, or we don't want any transvestites or BDSM people in our community, or we don't want any drugs in our community or alcohol in our community. In fact, I've actually come across some types of anarchists who believe that as well, left and right. So you would also find a proliferation of exclusionary communities because there's no forced cultural integration. So you have extreme cultural pluralism and diversity on one hand, and you also have exclusionism on the other hand. And then it would also, I think, depend on things like the particular forms of production that were organized. For instance, I think that more collective communities would probably be stricter in terms of individual behavior, because the group would be more interdependent on one another. Like, for example, the rule would be, if you live in our commune, yes, you have to share in the work, and no, you can't, urinate on the porch or whatever, that kind of thing. Whereas in some communities, that kind of stuff probably wouldn't be any big deal. For instance, I could see the proliferation of squats, anarchist squats, where, if you want to take a dump on the floor or something, you can do that, assuming the people there don't care. I know people, by the way, who live like that. So it's that might be another way. But I also think more agricultural communities would be more conservative in many ways, like they are now. I mean, small farming towns are notoriously culturally conservative. Also, another issue is, minus the state, that would tend to have the effect of strengthening other kinds of organizations, because people would want, if the people no longer identified with the state and no longer received a lot of services and help that they get from the state. I mean, if there was no state providing education, no state building roads, no state providing for protection against crime or fire department or whatever, no state providing health care, no state cleaning up the environment, whatever, then these are things that, assuming people want these done, and most people do, they're going to have to be done through other kinds of communities and other kinds of organizations and other kinds of institutions. So ironically, that could have the effect of strengthening certain kinds of traditional institutions, religion, family, local community, all these kinds of things. And not necessarily on one universal model, like not necessarily one religion or set of religions, not necessarily one family model. You could actually see the return, for example, of the extended families and polygamy and all these kinds of things, along with the nuclear family, bourgeois model of the family, as well as these pansexual, multi-gender families or whatever. So you would see, I think you would see a strengthening of these kinds of things, strengthening of family, religion, cultural institutions, but in a way that's not necessarily what a lot of more traditional conservatives envision either. And I think this is one thing the left type anarchists wouldn't actually like. I think they wouldn't like the fact that you would have actually the development of exclusionary communities that were, collective in that way. I think both the cultural conservatives and the cultural left have a fairly narrow and constrained vision on these kinds of questions, because you would see the proliferation of extreme cultural diversity without the state, including, like I said, some really far out stuff. But it would also have the effect of allowing for exclusion, allowing for the strengthening of non-state institutions of other types that may have strong collective values in terms of, well, no, you can't do this if you want to be part of our society.
Yeah, exactly. I think one aspect of social life that we need to look at is when you have a state, international economy, and a state that engages in welfarism. There's certain kinds of behaviors and ways of life that are incentivized and really only are allowed to be practiced because of that particular system. So, for example, most anarchists tend to admit that there wouldn't be a national economy, that the modes of production would be smaller. Walmarts probably wouldn't proliferate throughout an anarchist society. Now, with the beginning of the birth control pill and access to abortion, American sexual habits changed dramatically to a more permissive libertine perspective. And as we also see with abortion, the state has continued to subsidize it, so it's basically stay the same price if you control for inflation since the 1970s. And so, that's all gone. and you have I'm sure you have small scale production of some family planning materials, but it won't be an inundated market like it is now. I think in the absence of the state, the absence of the national economy, there would be a broad move to a more conservative lifestyle because the material conditions are such that, except for a few people who are willing to pay the price for it, either in terms of health or lack thereof, and other factors, most people just wouldn't do it. In the same sense that in the 1920s, yeah, you could go around being a hedonist, just visiting prostitutes and snorting coke all the time, but you probably would die at 25 or have some sexually transmitted disease for the rest of your life. And because none of these things would be available to help you out or put you back together, also the rich, right, are notoriously promiscuous because they're so wealthy. They can pay people to put them back together again after they fell off the wall like Humpty Dumpty. But without these factors there, I think there will be a meta shift to a more conservative lifestyle, even if there are regional variances. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you'd see some of both. I think it's possible you might see the proliferation of, for example, religious communes and religious monasteries and communities like you're talking about, like in the early America, for example. A lot of early America was essentially a collection of religious communes. I'm using the term commune in a broad sense, but we have to consider, okay, Massachusetts was founded by Puritans. Rhode Island was founded by Baptists. Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers. Utah was founded by the Mormons.
So I think Catholics.
I'm sorry.
Maryland by Catholics.
Yeah. And so I do think that you would see this. I do think that minus the state, which would lead to the strengthening of other kinds of community institutions, you might see a proliferation of religious monasteries, religious communes that might have the kind of conservative ethos or whatever that you're talking about, more of an ascetic way of life. Parallel to that, you probably would see, I think, probably the opposite too. You would also see the proliferation of, what in some countries are called red light districts and stuff like that. That's very libertine oriented. As far as people that are overly indulgent can damage their health and stuff like that, that doesn't stop people. I've known multiple people who've died of heroin overdoses and stuff like that. So there are no 90-year-old heroin addicts, by the way. The average, what the research shows is that when a person becomes addicted to heroin, their average lifespan is about 15 years from there on, assuming the addiction is not implemented. Yeah. So yeah, that's why we don't have any 90-year-old heroin addicts. But yeah, so I think you would see that kind of extreme dichotomy there as well. But I think this would apply to everything, not just to cultural values. But it would apply, again, to technology and economics. I think you would see some extreme collectivism and some extreme individualism and some extreme primitivism and low-tech, agrarian-type technology cultures that where their technological orientation was that, along with the rapid proliferation of other kinds of technologies and the stagnation of other kinds. So I don't think there's this one universal system that would come out of this.
Mm-hmm. I guess here's another question. When it comes to sort of like services, market services or market products, given the wide range of known anarchist movements, where do you think they would have sort of a specialization? Like I could easily imagine the Christian anarchists sort of becoming the dominant agribusiness, think of like the Amish and the Hutterites. I could see the more libertarian style anarchists being more of the leading entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. So how do you see maybe sort of like the specialization breaking down for different societies within this broader anarchist umbrella?
Yeah, I think that it would come down to, again, I think the cultural foundation of some of this is important, and their philosophical orientation. You're right that the ANCAP types tend to be very entrepreneurial oriented, and they would be the dominant sector in the business world, the commercial world. The Christian anarchists, a lot of those do tend to be agrarian oriented as well. As for the collectivists, anarcho-communists, I suspect that just raw manufacturing and stuff like that is largely where that sector would be dominant. I think you'd see things like workers' councils and communes and places like that, where the the actual manufacturing work was actually done, building transportation systems or whatever. And I think that would overlap with probably these people like the transhumanists and all that, because the syndicalist workers organizations and the workers councils and the workers communes, they're not going to want to go out and dig trenches and stuff like that. They're going to be very receptive to the idea of using technology as a means of overcoming this kind of work. So they would probably be in league with the transhumanists trying to develop robots that could go out and lay the railway for high-speed rail or something in that way.
Oh, and maybe the anarcho-primitivists would be corner the market on substances and drugs with all their knowledge of herbs and everything.
Yeah, probably. That might be the basis of their economy. They'd be the pot and magic mushroom farmers. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Plus pottery and hand knitted quilts and stuff like that. Yeah, but we were talking about the dichotomy between culturally conservative groups and more libertine or cosmopolitan ones. For those people who really take the primitivism ideal seriously, we have to remember that primitive people are notoriously exclusionary of outsiders. There was a story recently about the missionary guy that went to the North Sentinelese Islands. He's saying he's going to do missionary work, and of course, this is one of these uncontacted tribes, and they actually killed the poor guy. So that's not exactly an open society there. Okay, you come on our island, we run a spear through you. And I do think that primitivist, a culture that really it develops along those lines, along the lines of primitive agrarian, norms, would be very hostile to outsiders in that way.
I also think that you mentioned earlier the transhumanists and the syndicalists teaming up to develop more effective means of production. I think they'd also both tend to be more cosmopolitan and libertine in their values. And they'd be a natural cultural ally in that regard as well. But see, here's the question, Keith. How do you resolve the dispute where the anarcho-primitivists are protesting the mining operation that's being run by the syndicalists and the transhumanists?
Well, that gets back to one of the most important questions pertaining to anarchism. Because, of course, when you talk about anarchism with ordinary people, they'll say, well, that's crazy. That's a system where everybody's just going to kill everybody else or something like that. That's most people envision anarchism as just a field day of crime and looting and violence and that kind of thing. And there are some anarchists who don't do anything to dispel that perception. But the big issue is, how do you go about controlling aggressive behavior and settling disputes in a way that doesn't involve civil war or some groups just flat out stepping on other people? I think that there would be a wide range of ways of dealing with this. Well, one of the first things comes down to cultural norms. I tend to be of the viewpoint, and there's plenty of people besides me and before me who developed this idea, that political institutions and economies are largely reflective of the wider cultural underpinnings in which they exist. Now, they also have an interactive, symbiotic relationship, so I'm not really a cultural determinist. I think culture and technology and politics all that interact with each other. But to have an anarchist society that endured over any amount of time, like let's say we're going to have an anarchist society that exists, in a large region of the world, like North America or Western Europe or China or something, for 1,000 years, all right? There's going to have to be a cultural foundation that maintains that. And we can use other things as an example. Like in the United States, for example, we have this long-standing tradition of supposed democracy, or now a lot of people say, well, it's not really democracy, it's a plutocracy, an oligarchy, and I think that's true, but a republic, a formally democratic republic. We have this long-standing tradition, and then the military is a separate institution from civilian government and things like that. And then there's separation of powers between the different branches of government. And in the United States, what has kept the military, which is the largest military, well, certainly the wealthiest and most technologically advanced military in world history, what has kept them from simply taking over the civilian government? Well, you could argue they really control it by indirect means. So what's the point? But there's also this this well-established, deeply ingrained cultural tradition that the political institutions and the military are at least supposed to be formally separated. So I think you would have to have a cultural foundation in an anarchist society that says, okay, there needs to be some peaceful means of settling disputes without bloodshed and without some groups just simply dominating others, just saying, okay, we want it this way and we've got bigger guns, so, that's how we're going to do it. I got one question I've been asked a number of times is, if you had a situation where there was an anarcho-capitalist business enterprise and an anarcho-syndicalist workers federation, and the anarcho-syndicalists went on strike against the anarcho-capitalists, right, and say occupied the means of production, how would you resolve that? Would you have a shootout between the strike breakers, and corporate militia hired by the anarcho-capitalists versus the workers' militia of the anarcho-syndicalists? And yeah, that could potentially happen. It's certainly things similar to that have happened before. But a better way is to have peaceable means that are mutually agreed upon for settling disputes. Now, that's not always going to happen. There's so many things that sometimes there are irreconcilable differences. But I think that there would have to be a common cultural ethos where people generally favor settling things peacefully, and people generally understand that settlements to disputes should be based on some kind of reciprocal values. Now, some are more reciprocal than others, but the ideals are never lived up to fully in practice. But these underlying values, I think, need to be there. Just like in the current society, it's the common understanding that if somebody commits a crime, they're entitled to due process, they're entitled to a jury trial or a trial by an impartial party. Now, whether we live up to that is a separate question, but the ideal is still there, as opposed to having blood feuds, family feuds, the Hatfields and McCoys and stuff like that. So I think this kind of cultural norm would have to be there, and there would have to be some means of settling disputes. And then this gets into things like ownership rights, like the libertarians and ANCAPs talk a lot about property rights, and anarcho-communists will say they don't really believe in private property, but they do believe in a kind of collective private property. Like, well, okay, if it's their commune, you have an anarcho-communist commune, who's going to, can anybody that wants to come in the commune and take whatever they want? And what if the commune decides they want more land? Well, there's the commune next door, we want to take some of their land. So those kinds of issues are going to still be there. And I think that, again, there would have to be, largely localized arrangements worked out by local groups through local means of settling disputes is how this would have to take place. Some would probably have more efficient means of settling disputes than others. Like some might use the processes that are often used in private institutions now, like mediation, arbitration, negotiation. Some might have, a private court system, like the anarcho-capitalist visions, where you actually go to a court with, like a common law court, like the old British common law courts, or like there are others might just have customary practices. Well, okay, if Commune A and Commune B can't get along, we go to the Council of Elders or whatever that's represents a wider federation of communes and see what they have to say. There's all kinds of ways in which this can be done. But the two key issues are reciprocity. Settlements to disputes need to be reasonably balanced, and nonviolence, not bloodshed. And then that gets, of course, into the big issue of what about criminal behavior, just out and out criminal behavior. Not talking about disputes over economic resources or labor management and all that kind of stuff. What about armed robbers and murderers and rapists and all these kinds of people? On that issue, that's an important question too, because that's obviously one of the big objections to anarchism. Some anarchists believe that minus the state or minus the institutions that are facilitated by the state, there's not going to be crime. They think, well, in a world of plenty or a world of equality, it's not going to be very many criminally inclined people, so it's not that big of a deal. That's a more utopian view. There's other people who say, well, with a more equitable balance of resources or less competitive society or something like that, you're not going to have as many pathological people that are inclined to antisocial behavior. Again, maybe so, maybe not. But I tend to look at it like, well, when it comes down to it, what about somebody who does kill people for fun, serial killers and stuff like that? I tend to look at it like that would be settled. Those kinds of issues will be handled by different groups in different ways. The anarcho-capitalists envision things like private security forces and glorified security guards, and others are more into like glorified neighborhood watches or worker militias or community militias or citizen posses or all sorts of ways of trying to corral criminal behavior, violent. And when I say criminal, I mean not necessarily, not in the sense of technically violating a law, but just common crime, violent, aggressive, predatory behavior. And I think one issue is going to be how much of that is there. These issues would be handled in part on the basis of how much of this kind of behavior was there. Let's say that, the state goes away in New York City, right? You see a wide proliferation of cultural diversity as a result, but you also see the emergence of a large violent gang criminal culture, right? Well, that's obviously going to be a much more serious issue than if you have a situation, well, no, actually, there's not much of that. Like maybe localized communities are better at, policing their own members and activities. And if somebody's a thief, they just kick them out. And, if this guy gets kicked out of so many communities, he's not welcome anywhere. So he's pretty much left, relegated to sleeping by the pier and begging for change or something. To the degree that stuff like that is a problem, the more sophisticated a means you're going to have of dealing with it. But I don't think there's any one way. I think there's a multiplicity of ways that can be resolved, and there are a lot of different variations among anarchists on this question.
Yeah, two things came to my mind on this question. Is we mentioned the Holy Roman Empire last episode, and there was a famous struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor on who's going to appoint the bishops. The investiture controversy, it was called. And since neither side could rub the other out, they agreed on a compromise where the bishop who was appointed had to meet both of their standards. So one could envision a kind of between anarchist federations arbitration group that had individuals who were appointed, but they were checked off by the relevant anarchist federations who would appeal to it for dispute. So he would be approved by the Syndicalist Federation, he'd be approved by the Christian Anarchist Federation, he'd be approved by the Libertarian ANCAP Federation. And so then they would then market themselves as we're accredited as being accepted by all these people. So if you want to have your problems resolved peacefully and effectively, choose us. The other thing that I see when it comes to like policing is something a lot like early America before the FBI. Before the FBI and the nationalized policing, there were state polices, but they were not allowed to cross state borders, generally speaking. So criminals could rob you in one state. And since the crime was committed in another state, they were not necessarily liable in the state they fled to. Now, in order to combat that, what ended up happening was the groups like the Pinkertons developed a private police force, which could then cross state borders. So I'm thinking something along like those lines would probably develop in order to deal with federation jumpers, so to speak. You commit a crime, and especially if the crime that's committed in the anarcho-syndicalist community is not considered a crime in the ANCAP community to which they flee. And so you could presumably solve that problem in the same way with having these sort of trans-federation, quote-unquote private police forces that would be able to travel through all these communities to apprehend, basically bounty hunters, to be honest, is really the word I'm looking for.
Well, I think, you've raised a number of good points with that. One point is that, as far as the FBI, that was initially intended to be a political police force. That was Woodrow Wilson's National Secret Police Force. And they've also been extended into other kinds of investigations. I mean, they do criminal investigations pertaining to tracking serial killers and all that too, but they were originally intended to be a political police force. But the idea of different jurisdictions, you do have that even today in some places. For example, in some states, some countries do not have extradition treaties with other countries, or won't extradite fugitives from one place to another just over political disagreements or cultural disagreements. Like Roman Polanski, the movie director, he got busted for statutory rape back in the 1970s, and he just went to France, and the French were like, well, we don't care about this, so they've refused to extradite him for 40 years now. I think that that's a possibility if you have a lot of different communities, and you have some communities that consider certain behaviors to be criminal or against the community norms. One form of quote unquote punishment might just be simply to expel that person to some community where that's acceptable. Like, let's say you have a community that says, okay, you can't do halal animal slaughter in this community, and somebody says, well, I want to do it anyway. Well, okay, fine, we'll exile you to the Islamist community where you can do that. It's that might be one way of handling that. I think, though, that a more serious, another issue, though, might be that some of these kinds of protection services may have a policy where they don't offer protection to people who flagrantly violate each other's norms. Like, let's say you have the Grateful Dead militia, the hippie counterculture militia or whatever. All right, they may say, well, if you go and adulterate the wife of the God's Lightning militia, well, too bad, because you're in deep whatever.
You're in trouble.
Yeah, right. So if you flagrantly flout other people's values or whatever, we're not going to, risk a war with another group for that. But I think the big question, though, is what about genuinely serious, dangerous, violent behavior, not just disagreements over cultural norms? What about organized crime? What about large gang-like groups and that kind of stuff? I think that's the real issue. And what about genuinely predatory, aggressive, armed robbery, serial killers, rapists? Again, some anarchists say, well, then, a different kind of culture, different kind of institutions, there would be less of that. Maybe there would, maybe there wouldn't be. Maybe there'd be more of it. I don't really know myself. I think that would depend on a lot of variables. But there does obviously need to be a means of dealing with people like that. And then there's a question of, well, how do you apprehend them? How do you avoid just having vigilante justice and dueling, or maybe dueling would be okay, but maybe blood feuds? How do you avoid that? How do you avoid? How do you have due process for people that are accused of doing something awful without just lynching them or whatever? I think those are the real issues when it comes to the whole crime question. And then once it's determined somebody has done all these things, what are you going to do with them? You're going to execute them. You're going to put them in jail. You're going to send them to a penal colony. You're going to reduce their allowance, or what are you going to do to them?
Yeah. Well, we're nearing the end of the hour. So is there anything that you'd want to leave us with on after the state what?
Just that I think that the key issue is that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all model. And I think that that's the main thing that many, if not most, anarchists get wrong. Because the title of our website is Pan-Anarchism, because this series of podcasts with you and I are doing is about Pan-Anarchism. That's one of the reasons why I call myself a Pan-Anarchist, is because there's many different kinds of anarchism. There's not just one anarchism. And a civilization, a society, a world, or region, or whatever, where anarchism became prevalent, there wouldn't be just one anarchism. There wouldn't be just one way of doing all these different kinds of things. There's not going to be, we're not going to have Rothbardian world domination, or Chomskyite world domination, or Murray Bookchinite world domination. Anarchism by definition means diversity, pluralism, and lots of different ways of doing things, including things, as I said, that represent extreme dichotomies between, say, libertinism and asceticism, or technology and primitivism, or collectivism and individualism. Those dichotomies are always going to be there, and more so, I think, minus the state trying to impose a universal set of institutions and norms and practices.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Keith. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.